the start of the current open education movement is difficult to define due to varying interpretations and the journey that we as a community of people who believe in open education or who would want open education to be a reality in higher education have taken. So when we look at definitions or looking at meanings, we will see that it is not viewed as an identity. So open education is not a single entity, but as a collection of approaches that have contributed to this idea. And considering open access in education, it is necessary for us to look at and review different aspects and interpretations of open education and bring strands together. So these three strands that would contribute to this whole idea that I would like to briefly look at is first open universities, open education resources and MOOCs. Yeah, so though the title does say open education resources and MOOCs, but I thought it would be useful for spending a few minutes in even looking at this whole idea of open universities. Now, when we look at the interpretations of open universities and we look at how this can be traced back, we will see that it had its earliest beginnings, and this much of the discussions that I have is from an open access book that is by Martin Weller, and so therefore much of the thoughts are taken from his book and the chapter on open education, free access to education for all. Okay, and here when we see that, and therefore he says, if we look at it, it's South Africa's founded, it's in 1946, this distance education. Now for us today, for those of us who have been a little more into higher education or at our age group, will remember that even in our universities, we had distance education, where today this is renamed and it has got a different meaning when we have started even naming those departments differently. So when this whole idea of distance education model was started in order to help people who wouldn't be able to attend the traditional institutions, and due to various reasons, social, economic and different other reasons, we'll see that the early beginnings of this whole idea of open comes from this introduction of distance education. And of course we see other countries later on in the 60s, 70s, and it was interesting to see that much of open education had its publications reached its height in the late 70s and 80s, when you see a lot of literature available on open education. This also we'll see, it also can be traced back to public movements, which was founded even in 1903, where it talked about how the working class education can, during the Industrial Revolution, how would we be able to reach out to them and how would we be able to get them into the educational systems. So the establishment of open universities and its models, therefore, was widely then emulated and was a basis for starting at various places around the globe. Or originally proposed as a wireless university in 1926, and it was supported in the 1960s. We also would see that the open universities aimed to open up education, okay, for those away from the conventional system, and therefore even as we progressed in time and the whole idea evolved due to various changes even in the technological world as well as economic and social changes and developments around the globe, we see that this idea, Cormier suggests that open stands for accessibility. Okay, accessibility supported open learning. When we talked about open, accessible, supported open learning, it meant interaction, it meant dialogue. And in this interaction and dialogue were the key concepts of accessibility. It was not only opening doors and allowing, but as we moved on, it talked about this interaction dialogue. We talk about equal opportunities, unrestricted barriers or impediments to education and educational resources. We talked about transparency. It held up the values of transparency, wherein therefore when we look at any form of open education resource, or even when you look at MOOCs, etc., you will see that we are asked, or it is most of open education resources do share about educational aims. What is it that we are expected? What is the objectives for students? It discloses the marking system. It helps you to be able to understand and get a bird's eye view of what is committed to do through the resource, as well as what is expected of the learner and where they need to go. And all this we see was needed, and all that was needed was an ambition and a will to act as a motivation to learn. So, in this whole thing, it also encompasses motivation. So, but with the advent of open source softwares, then open and free began to be linked. But it wasn't that free that every time we talked about open education, it meant free, okay? And therefore, it got linked together with these kind, of course it has its challenges. We've seen how it has, even in many ways, deviated from these kind of, what we're talking of, thoughts, ideas, etc. But that's where the introduction of this we could move. We'll also now look at this whole, do you see that William and Flora Hewitt Foundation? Now we're looking at the next strand, that is open education resources. Now when we are talking about open education resources as teaching and research materials in public domains or released under a license allowing free use and repurposing. So remember, we are now at our second strand when we are looking at this whole interpretation of open education resources. We are looking at now the new dimensions that emerge, and what characterizes it. It is about licensing, free using, and also repurposing of content that is available. So it includes this word, this concept, includes the full courses, course materials, modules, textbooks, any other tool materials or techniques that are used to support access to knowledge. That is what open educational is defined as by the Hewlett Foundation. And then you look at Creative Commons, which we are most familiar with. Here it is, what characterizes Creative Commons is the right to reuse content. And what I found moving towards this whole idea from access to inclusion is I picked up this definition of Lane 2009, which talks about openness being interpreted by a movement that is centered around freedoms. Freedom offered and associated with open licensing. So freedom from, there we see freedom from paying money to access the use of content. We'll see freedom to copy and make more copies, to take away and reuse without asking for prior permissions if licenses are being permitted. And now we look at, therefore, the interpretations of open education in terms, the third strand that is looking at MOOCs. Now when we talk about MOOCs, of course the dictionary is, the Collins Dictionary says it's a free online course that many people can study. Okay, but MOOCs were free to access, but they generally did not come to adopt an open license, so their content did not boast the freedom set out which were for the OER. And we also know over a period of time, to access the course could be free, but to be certified not necessarily got associated with the idea of free. Okay? And therefore we'll see that two movements that we have now. The Third movement of MOOCs is also a movement with the open criteria, that is open in terms of accessibility, in terms of equal opportunity, transparency, and also open entry in terms of not probably having certain kinds of requirements for entrance qualifications. Yeah, so that is what we really look at when we talk of free now. Now, of course, we have its challenges, its problems. For example, all literature would tell you, and your own experience will tell you, that there is a low completion rate when it comes to MOOCs. Okay? Learner demographics poses its own challenge. We see sustainability, another kind of challenge, and sustainable business models also. Because of course, you and me in the field of education would see that no longer has open education been used for only the purpose of social justice and getting people in, etc. We've seen a lot of privatization of open education also taking place. And the moment we see that, we'll see business demands also having its pressures on those who are in that field of open education. And therefore, we'll see these are some of its challenges. Now, understanding these three strands and interpretations that contribute to open education, we just quickly look at this research where they have tried to understand what are these different areas, and they identified 8 different themes around which open education and openness revolve around. Now, looking at that, I think the diagram is not, but graphically, this is how it also tells you in terms of, where do you really find more kind of articles, etc. But because I think I took it as a snapshot and it may not be very visible, but I thought I'll take this as an excerpt, which at least you would be able to, again, a picture which talks about these 8 areas. Okay, so it's open distance education, e-learning, open education in schools, OER, MOOCs, social media, OA publications, and OEP. Also, that has also been the areas where all these, if you look at the other side, that is what is the primary driver. I would want you to take note of that as we move to our next part of discussion, as how do we then look at all these as a tool for inclusion, or how do we use these kind of drivers for making and contributing to higher education that would be inclusive. Of course, being from the area of special education, etc., I'm not dwelling on this, but you would agree with me that sharing, free access, reusing, support in terms of content, delivery, and allowing us to retweak content, reuse, access, etc., depending upon our diverse learners, and we being diverse as teachers ourselves, and how do we share and build a community that stands for all this, would be the closest way to say higher education moving towards inclusion. When we are able to deliver those kind of promises that open education has in store. And therefore, again, I'm taking a quote from Martin Weller, who says, education is first and foremost an enterprise of sharing. So a definition of education is an enterprise of sharing. In fact, sharing is the sole means by which education is effective. And openness can then be argued to be central to the process of higher education. Using this thought, using this premise, we will see therefore that openness then needs to be the central driver in higher education in many a times that we are engaging with students, with colleagues, and with the community at large. And if you look at where has open education in higher education really made some kind of an impact and impression, it is based on content, in terms of delivery and in terms of recognition. Now, content means it is a tool, it is a medium, sometimes it is there, it's not, it's a space wherein content is transacted in terms of subject knowledge, support, guidance, learning analytics, all this together comes under this whole area where open education has really contributed to. The second part that we see is in terms of delivery, in terms of qualities of place, space, timings of delivery of content. How do we do and how do we transact in higher education, and how do we make teaching, learning engaging, enjoyable and accessible as well as meant for all or reaching out to all, is there's where open education again makes a significant contribution. And thirdly, in terms of recognition. Recognition is nothing but the kind of ways in which we assess how are we giving credentialization of the entire engagement of students and teachers in the whole teaching learning process that is governed by this whole concept of openness, and that's where open education has made has made contributions and even in many ways transformed ideas and transformed the way in which we think of content, delivery as well as recognition. Now, a few thoughts about us who still are at a point, and the major challenge that I face, even for myself, is I engage in MOOCs, I engage in open education resources because the word that comes to my mind is accessibility. But do we end or begin and end our journeys in the open education world with accessibility alone? Okay, and open education resources and MOOCs, if they are about content, then is content neutral or apolitical? And one needs to be mindful. I'm just going to throw a few questions for us to think. I have no answers to these, but definitely a personal view to this is the content that we create, we transact and engage with. Can we ask ourselves, well, what drives that kind of content that we exchange in the open education world? What are some of our naive understandings of open and that open concept that have affected in the achievement of higher education? Because we think naively about this whole concept of open education, it sometimes could be even an impediment in reaching the goals of higher education. We use these kind of resources that are available very often as delivery means rather than critically engaging students for transformation. 3 is how can delocalization of the production of teaching material, I'm writing these words of production, though it doesn't really go well with teaching material, but I have taken this because most of our requirements in higher education is how many teaching materials have you produced. Okay, now we can ask these kind of questions later, but I'm asking is, when we talk about reaching out to wide, do we sometimes lose focus of localization of the whole content, and is concentration on profit come in the way of our understanding open education for inclusion? The first question when you are asked that you want to engage in even developing a MOOCs is, so what would the income be for the institution? And things that will that drive our engagement, or is it those higher ideals for which we need to shift focuses from these kind of pressures that we engage with? Then open education and ideas are sustained by various movements, but sometimes and very often have these movements, even in open education, restricted autonomy and creativity by expecting, certain forms of templates, certain forms of procedures, certain forms in which knowledge should be and could be delivered. But a question for all of us is autonomy of ideas, creation of collaborative spaces, and very often it becomes an individual possession rather than a collaborative space. Lastly, as pointed out, I'm using again a quote, and for which I would ask a question. OER means freedom, citizenship, knowledge for all, social progress and transformation. So when we look at open education, when we look at this whole area of, whether you term it as MOOCs, whether you term it as open education, whether you look at it in terms of universities or a combination of all these ideas, do we relook at it in terms of how do people engaged in that feel a sense of freedom, has experienced citizenship, looks at social progress, and does this really, the content, our transactions and our recognitions help for transformation of individuals, or do we settle for those lower end objectives that higher education is striving towards? Can a critical analysis of our engagement with open education reflect these values, which are values similar to inclusion, is a question that probably I would like that each one of us think about. And finally, in closing, I would say we as educators are responsible for taking accountable actions and implementing a comprehensive plan which will engulf, which will cover all those various virtues, values with which open education began historically, and we are moving towards that kind. And where are we moving in our journeys of understanding, and as a community and individual, can we then pause, prepare plans which are mindful of these markers and move beyond promising that these are automatic outcomes of engaging in open education. With this, this is essential for inclusion to be a reality and a way of life, rather than for us to look at it as a movement that runs parallel in higher education. Thank you.